Hello and welcome to the Pink Elephant webinar series. Today we are going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and I certainly hope it is one of yours. Mastering the human response to change, from denial to new beginnings. My name is Isabel Feher-Watters and I work at Pink Elephant. This is a topic that I'm very interested in, and I feel that I've been talking about it in one way or another for many, many years. As a matter of fact, probably throughout my whole career. My background is in human resources, learning and development, credentialing, business management. I've worked in corporate, not-for-profit, and associations. And no matter what work I've done, people and change have always been a part of it. Now we're going to spend our time together talking about this very intriguing topic. And we're going to look at how people actually respond to change. As we go through this, I want you to think about how you respond to change and how you as a leader or manager or as a colleague can support others going through some major changes or even small changes in their workplace or even in their personal lives. So why is this important? Why is this important to us now? Well, what we know, the research tells us, is that up to 70% of change initiatives fail in part or in whole. 70%. Think about that. Think about that. That's an astonishing number. And actually, it's even a frightening number when you think about it, 70%. And in fact, if we were to look at the statistic 20 years ago, we would have gotten 70% again. So why can't we break this cycle? What are we failing to do? Something surely is going wrong. Let's take a closer look at what the 70% looks like. What if you were to get a piece of pie, and that piece of pie had 70% removed from it, so you only got a 30% of the pie? How about if the next time you got your paycheck, 70% was held back? Well, you'd be incensed. You'd be not so happy. In fact, you'd probably even be outraged. And so when 70%, we know that 70% is considerable. And when 70% of change initiatives fail, there is a huge, huge impact on time, on money, effort, people, the resources, the morale of the organization. So really, we have to stop this. I challenge each and every one of you listening to this. We have to do something. We cannot be sitting here 10 years from now talking about the same thing. So what is the problem? Well, we've done a lot of research at Pink Elephant, and others have done research around this as well, and there's a number of reasons things can go wrong. But the two major indicators, or the two major reasons for something to go wrong, is number one, the process side of the change is not managed effectively, or not managed till the very end. And secondly, the people side is not managed very effectively at all, or perhaps not even managed at all. Think about it if you've ever gotten something at work where an email comes through and it says something like, effective immediately, this is no longer going to happen. Or effective, in 30 days, this is going to happen. That can be a challenge. It can be a shock to you. So our agenda, we are going to look at the people side of it, because by now you've almost got to be convinced that it is all about the people. We're going to look at the change curve, something that you might be familiar with, that you might have heard about in the past. We'll look at various stages of transition and renewal, and start to look at some of the ways that we can help as leaders and managers, and some of the top 10 things that we can start with right now to make a difference. Now, I know that you're not directly in front of me, but I would like to begin with you. What I'd like you to do is I would like you to cross your arms. Take note of which arm is the dominant arm, which is on top. This is a picture of me, and you see for me it's my right arm. Now unfold your arms and refold them or cross them the opposite way. The opposite way, where your least dominant hand is not on top. How does that feel? Were you able to do it? Is it something you'd like to do? Well, one of the things that I've noticed, I've asked several people over the years, actually hundreds of people over the years about this, and every time it has been difficult for people to do. It has been difficult for them, unless they've practiced, of course. What about if I was to ask you to write with your right hand, and then put down the pen and write with your left hand? Depending on which is your dominant hand, it would be easy or hard to write. Correct? I'm correct about this, right? Could you do it? Would you do it? What about if I was to ask you to use your least dominant hand all day long? What would happen? Would you revert back to your other hand? You probably would. Would you question it? Absolutely. Would you think it was a silly idea? Absolutely. And it would also probably slow down your work and be very difficult for you to do. Now, what about if I was to give you an incentive? What about if I was to say something like, let's all write with our least dominant hand all day long, and at the end of the day, if we all do that and not revert back to our right hand or our left hand, then we'll contribute some money to a charity. So there's an incentive there. Or you'll get chocolates at the end of the day. Again, there's an incentive there. That might be easier for us to go along with. It might make us feel better. So, when we look at change in the work environment, we have to consider that we are dealing with people, and people do have feelings, and they do have areas that are more important to them, and so we do have to respect that. I love this quote. People don't resist change, they resist being changed. Isn't this so true? It's not so much about the change, because in fact, change is growth. Change is innovation, it's being creative, it's doing new things. But it's when people don't have an opportunity, perhaps, to contribute, they don't have an opportunity to hear about it ahead of time, that they really feel that they're being changed. So we know it's about the people. And one of the things we have in common as humans is we have a lot of traits in common in terms of how we respond to change. There's certain behavior characteristics and psychological phases we go through that we're going to talk about in a minute. We also have individual differences and preferences. We have individual likes and dislikes. Some of us are more flexible than others. And so when we respond to change, these two things come into play. A third thing that comes into play is really about our past experiences with change. We might have had past experiences that were good, others that weren't so good. So we may have come out of a change in an organization where we were not very pleased with the outcome. We might be not trusting this new change in the organization that we're working in now. So we're going to respond to things based on that. We're going to hold back a little bit. We're going to be very, very cautious. So these are the ways that we would respond. Let's take a closer look at this. The human response to change, the change curve. Some of you might be familiar with this change curve. You may have seen it in a similar model, but in a different format. It's based on the work done by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who did a lot of work with death and bereavement. And she said that, people go through very similar psychological stages because we're all human. We all share common characteristics. This model has since been adopted by organizational development, change management, human resources, learning and development, and management studies to really look at how do people respond in an organization. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to tell you a little bit about, okay, let's go through this and what are the kinds of things that you will hear and see. Or if this is about you, then what you will feel. So let's take a look at the left-hand side of the screen. On the left-hand side, we see morale, energy, and performance. And as you can see, along the bottom, we're looking at it. The bottom is time-based. So we're looking at the past and then looking into the future. So when we first start off, what happens is when there's some information that we get that we're really not expecting, shock sets in. And when shock sets in, things you hear are, I don't believe it. I don't know what to do. This really can't be happening. They can't do this. And what happens then is that morale and energy, performance will decrease a little bit. And then what happens is that very quickly can turn into denial. And the denial piece is this isn't really happening. It's okay, we'll just continue along. Now, one of the things to make note about in this change curve and this process is that people go through these in various pieces. So they may go through them very, very quickly. You might not even notice a couple of steps, and then they may get stuck in an area. Or it might be, based on their other experiences, they might go through this really, really quickly. So when we start to look at this in a few minutes from a leadership perspective, we know that one of the things we have to do is we have to help people get through these phases. We can't get people to skip any, because that's not healthy. You'll end up with baggage at the end of it. But we help them get through it in a well-timed manner, so that people aren't sitting in any of these areas for too long. So here we go. There's the shock, the denial that sets in. I'm often asked a question at this point: why is it that energy, performance, and morale go up when there's denial? Well, you can think about that, and you can think about it in terms of, what would that look like, or what would that feel like? Well, what happens is that during denial, it feels like nothing's changed. And if nothing's changed, then, you go along status quo and your energy continues. But then what happens is that the reality starts to set in, and then you can see something like anger or blame. And what you hear is, I'm not going to do it. Look at what they did. And you can actually see some passive and active resistance taking place, depending on the individual. Passive resistance would look like, well, just think about it. It would look like something if, individuals would still participate, perhaps in meetings and other activities, but they wouldn't be as active as they would usually be. So you might see somebody sitting there with their arms crossed, looking down to the ground, and really not participating. The other side of that, of course, is active resistance. Active resistance is somebody who's right in your face, and they're not happy, and they're angry, and they're letting you know, I'm not going to do it. Because there's a lot of emotions in this, both the anger, and then starts to move into blame, lashing out at others. So there's a lot of feelings of dread and helplessness, and so people demonstrate these and show these in very different ways. This could be, if you've got a lot of people going through this at the same time, it could be a time where you have to be very mindful, because it could be toxic to the organization. You don't want a lot of people in this area, because it's just not healthy. As the change moves along and people become more comfortable with it and start to see that, hey, it's not going away, there might be a little bit of bargaining, self-blame. I should have done something differently. If I would have done this, then maybe that wouldn't have happened. But then usually very quickly, people will slide into the depression and confusion state. This is a state that's very interesting, and again, it could be very toxic, because you'll see here that everything is at its lowest. Morale, energy, performance, all of that is at its lowest. And you hear things like, it's really no use. I don't care. I'm not sure. I miss the old way. Because the other thing too is people are in some form of transition. They already know that the past isn't going to be, and the way that they did things before isn't going to be, but that they have to move into the new state, into the future, and they may not really want to yet. So they're in transition. And this is a time as well too where, if you have a number of people in this, they can't stay in this. They really need to be nudged out of this so that they can start to see the light. They can start to move forward. Now, as you move into the acceptance and exploration stage, this stage is actually really exciting, or it starts to be exciting, because what you're starting to see is a shift. You see a shift. And so people are accepting, it is what it is, and then they're also saying, hey, let me try that. So there's a renewed sense of discovery, learning, and people are starting to move on. They've got more of a foot in the new camp than the old one, and you're starting to see some buzz, and you're starting to see some semblance of movement in the right direction. And then the last stage, commitment and rebuilding. I can do this. This is even better. It's going to work. There's hope, there's renewed energy, performance increases, and this is where people are really looking at new beginnings. They're flourishing. You see, they're thriving, and it's the state that you certainly want to get at. Now, another piece of this that isn't mentioned in this change curve is that you want to reinforce, and you want to make sure people continue in the new way, and that they don't default and they don't fall back. Remember when we crossed our arms, or even if you were writing with your least dominant hand, when we were using those examples? Well, the default would always be back to your dominant hand because that's what you're most comfortable with. And that's what happens in a change initiative as well, too. People will default to their comfort levels unless, the way they used to do things isn't there anymore, or that, there's real incentive to keep them into the new way of working. So there's another way of looking at this. And this one is more around stages of transition and renewal. And it's the same type of an idea, and this was brought to light by William Bridges in his book, Managing Transition. And you'll see it does go along a time continuum as well. And it's you start off with endings, and it's really psychological. It's a psychological process of adapting to change. You've got endings, and sometimes you feel like you're losing something. Well, I really liked the office that I sat in before because, I really liked the way the window faced, and I don't want to let go of it. There has to be at some point along the way some kind of a letting go. And then, as you let go, there's a neutral zone, and there's a real transition there. And then there's that light bulb that starts to go off, and as I mentioned, there's a shift into new beginnings. And that's what this model shows. It shows that, you sort of move along. This is so important to remember, that these psychological phases have to be gone through. They can be gone through really, really quickly. They cannot be missed, and people cannot get stuck in any area. One more thing that's worth mentioning about this is that people often ask themselves as well, too, when you say, hey, this is the way we're doing things right now, this is what we're going to change to, is they ask the very important question, which is it worth to me? Is it worth it to me? What's in it for me, and is it worth it to me? And think about that. Is it worth it? Is it worth it for the time and the effort and the struggle that sometimes we have to put into new things to make that change? And this formula, the change formula by Beckert and Harris, really identifies some of those key areas. So you want to make sure that the level of dissatisfaction that's very high with the status quo, that they really don't like the way things are going right now. The new way of doing things is really attractive to a lot of people, and that they want to do that, and that they're able to change. Think about that. And not only are they able to change, but that it's easy enough for them to get there, so that they can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah, the way we're doing things right now is not good. Yeah, the way we want to do things later on is really good, and I know how to get there. So there's the perceived cost of change is lower, and so people are going to want to move in the direction that the organization wants them to move in. A lot of things to think about, lots and lots of things to think about. So what does this all mean to us? Why are we talking about this? What can we do to make a difference with this? Well, let's look at this in a little bit of a different way. We've got our change curve here, but let's look at this from the perspective of a manager or leader in terms of, or a colleague. What can you do to help move a change initiative along? We've got 4 quadrants here: inform, support, direct, recognize, and celebrate. So in this first part, the change is new. People are just getting bits and pieces of the information or not. So really what you want to do is you want to minimize the effect early on with early communication. You want to be able to listen, to observe, to involve people. You really want to involve people and make sure that they understand what's going on. They have an opportunity to ask questions, and that, they know that somebody's caring about how they're feeling. And that, yeah, it may not feel that good to have to work in this new system, and it may be really disturbing to not be able to do your job as quickly as you did before, but it will get better, and it's okay. And so there's that whole aspect of informing, empathizing, but you also have to be realistic. You can't sugarcoat if something has to be changed. It cannot be sugarcoated that, hey, maybe you don't have to change it. No, they will have to change it. You cannot minimize the impact, but you can inform. Then from there, as they move through the psychological stages, you can support. And here, really, support is all about two-way communication, making sure that they know you understand. And there's a key thing, too, that we often forget about, and we don't mention when we talk about this, is that explain and let people know what they have not lost, what they have not lost. Oftentimes, we're so focused on stuff that we've lost and those things that we're not going to have anymore that we forget about the things that we haven't lost. Really important key thing to let people know and remind them. Remind them of the new state, that it is going to be much better. And certainly practice effective line management. Now, as the psychological stages move along, it's time to be more directive. Because remember, in this, at the bottom of this curve, people are in a very indecisive, confused kind of a state. They're not sure what's going on and where they fit in. So it's time for direction. Eliminate the confusion. Help re-anchor routines. We're all used to doing, coming into work and doing things a certain way. And when we have to change our routines, it can be a little bit upsetting. Help re-anchor routines. Yeah, we used to do it this way before, and it took about 7-8 steps to do it, but now we're going to do it this way. We have to get used to doing it this way, but it'll make our lives easier in the long run. When you're re-anchoring routines, help with job aids, learning aids, have posters, have things that people can put up on their wall that will reinforce the message and will help them re-anchor their routines, help them relearn. Build your teams. Encourage people to try new things and take risks. This is important because what happens is think about it, when there's something new, we have to do things a little bit differently, and sometimes that's a little bit risky, and we may be afraid because we might be making mistakes. Encourage new things. Let people know that they can take risks, and also let it be okay that they're making mistakes, and be sure that you're letting them know it's okay to make mistakes. Provide training and coaching, and certainly help people move to action. And then when you start to see that, they are moving to action, they are doing things a little bit differently, then start to recognize and celebrate the successes. Hey, that's the way to do it. Hey, you only did that in 10 minutes, and before it took you 15 minutes. Recognize, celebrate, and also, I would say, reinforce. Reinforce the message so that they don't fall back, so that there's no default going back to the old way of doing things. So important for managers and leaders to really remember that you can't just send out an email and say, hey, things are changing. You can't just say, hey, we've put a new system in place, everybody do your work differently, because really people have to, they need time and they have to figure out how to do things differently. You really need to help people thrive in their new work environment. So just before we close, I want to sort of reinforce and talk about top 10 things you could do now. And some of these are easy enough, and it's certainly easy enough to talk about. Not all of them are easy to do once you get back to the workplace, but start with something. Start with 1 or 2 and really try to focus in on them to help people in the rest of your organization move along. Create an open, transparent environment. So true, so true, so true. Sounds so easy to do, but not always so. Appoint or become the change agent to pay special attention to people and communications. Now, this can be a change agent, it can be an ambassador, it can be anybody you appoint. It's going to be somebody who is really interested in the new way of doing things, is able to do it, and is enthusiastic about it. So let them share their enthusiasm with the others. Let them show the others that, hey, yeah, you have to struggle a little bit, but boy, it's going to be really worth it. Let that person move other people along. Always reinforce the vision. We want to see that new way, the big picture. Get people involved early on, and certainly listen to their fears and concerns, because they're not necessarily going to go away unless they're dealt with. Make it okay to make mistakes and take risks. And do provide some form of training and learning aids and things that people can reference and allow them time to practice the new skill. They so need the time to practice it to become proficient. And let them know it's okay. They will be uncertain. And say, yeah, we all accept the uncertainty. There's some things we just don't know how they're exactly going to turn out. Deal with conflict. Very important point. I know of some managers in the past that I've worked with that have chosen not to deal with conflict and just hope that it would go away between a couple of people or 3 people, and in fact it never goes away unless it's brought out in the open and dealt with. And then finally, celebrate. Celebrate, celebrate, celebrate. Make sure that you celebrate and reinforce. So my final thoughts. Well, my final thoughts are really a question to you in terms of what will you do differently? What will you do differently? What will you do differently so that 10 years or 5 years from now, we're not sitting here talking about that, 70% of change initiatives fail or don't get completed fully. Maybe we're saying that 40% do that. Let's not be here 10 years from now talking about the same thing. And I challenge you also, to really, really think about this, and not only think about it, but do something about it. Create an open environment, communicate more, observe people, support people in your teams, in your organizations. Show your managers and leadership the change curve. Why not? Why not give people ideas about how they can help themselves and others? Show the presentation. Walk through the presentation. Let it be a kickoff for a strong, facilitated two-way dialogue with one person or with a team of people. So these really are my final comments, and I do really, really want to encourage you to look at this and to see what you can do differently in your work environment. In closing, thank you very much for spending the 30 minutes with me. I encourage you to contact me with questions you might have or additional information, or if you have some really good stories or some really good strategies that you found. Link in with me, connect with me on LinkedIn, and let's share the stories with others. Let's make sure that we are leading the charge on reducing the 70%. In closing, thank you again for taking the time out of your busy schedule, and I certainly hope to hear from you next time. And when I do hear from you, I'd love for you to tell me your stories about how change was managed in your organization and how really it was about the people. Thank you.